So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us on our 7th in our Fresh Thinking Live webinar series. Today's topic is going to be digital in a difficult market. The impact of lockdown measures to tackle COVID-19 has pretty much pushed the UK into what will probably be one of the worst recessions on record. And the impact of COVID-19 restrictions will probably make that an interesting very unique recession as it unfolds. The last recession in the UK was about 11 years ago, following the credit crunch, so 2009. So there are quite a number of highly seasoned digital marketers that have been working for 10 years that perhaps haven't really experienced what a recession can throw your way. So today we'll be discussing some of the topics that we feel are particularly important to keep on top of, and we've pulled together an outstanding panel of marketers, both offline and digital, to help us to do this. Their collective experience covers a wide array of sectors, including retail, property, finance, energy, legal, education, media, and the not-for-profit sector. They're all veterans of the 2009 recession, so have a lot of experience to share and have worked both in-house and agency side. So initial introduction, my name is Nate Wood. I'm a strategy director with FreshEgg. Back in 2009, I was head of digital for an agency that was specializing in digital marketing for recruitment agencies. So that sector took quite a big hit during that recession, so it was an interesting ride. Joining me today, we've got Debbie Britton, an interim CMO and independent marketing consultant. Debbie has extensive experience in both online and offline marketing across a variety of different sectors, and most recently has headed up teams at Empower, the Open University, and the National Accident Helpline Group. We also have joining us Cath Foster. Cath is a seasoned account director with FreshEgg and delivers guidance for some of our largest clients. She has also worked in-house and has a very good perspective on how organizations and customers react as markets get tougher. And we also have Anna Macleod, Director of Marketing and Innovation for Kinleigh, Folkard Hayward, one of London's leading property services groups. Anna will be sharing her international online and offline agency and in-house experience with us today. Some housekeeping: if you have a question at any point for our panelists, then please do use the Q&A function available within Zoom and post your question there, and we'll address those at the end. The other thing that we're going to really try to head off is this topic can be very doomy and gloomy. So what we want to do today is just focus on some of the positive actions that you can take away to better equip yourself for whatever the recession throws your way. So with no further ado, let's jump straight in. One of the immediate impacts of a recession is the need to review your marketing plan, especially if you're experiencing any kind of squeeze on resources or budget. So I'm going to open this one with Debbie. What is your advice for creating a pragmatic plan and budget?
So this is an interesting one. We've never had a recession like this, and I've actually worked through 2 recessions and the ups and downs in between. And this one isn't primarily driven by financial and economic situations. It's been driven by a pandemic. So it's new to all of us, I guess. The first thing I think we've got to do to address it is to really understand what sort of business we are, understand where the position that you're coming from. Have you been particularly badly hit? Are you pivoting the resources and the business? Are you in a booming sector? Because there are some booming sectors as a result of this, or have you been relatively undamaged? And that will determine how you then realign your marketing plan. I guess in all recessions, the hard reality is that you treat every single day like it's the start of a planning day, and every single day like it's a trading review day. So I think the advice of increasing your frequency of review of those numbers day in, day out is going to be pivotal to addressing the whole recession. It's a real, there's a two-way approach that I think is really critical to this. Whatever marketing plan was in place, it's then almost taking it and doing a bottom-up, top-down approach to see where actually you need to refocus it. So looking at every single activity and being really ruthless about which ones are really adding to the bottom line. So not just which ones are successful in the individual KPIs in themselves, but overall, are they adding up to something that is really putting something onto the bottom line for the business? And if you really cannot justify that, then don't do it, remove it from the plan. Now that's good planning practice, full stop, but I think there's a real microscopic approach to this during the recessional period that we've all got to get used to. It is hard work. It's also quite liberating in a way, because I do think it draws the whole team to the focus of the numbers. The KPIs might well be very different right now, and to have a finger on the pulse of what has changed, in what way, and at which part of the funnel, and therefore what impact does that have further down the funnel, is going to be really important to addressing where you need to place the activity and the resources. So it may be that just the basic of CPAs and acquisition costs, the whole margin at the bottom line, all of those might have to be reviewed. There might be new KPIs that give a greater focus now than they did before, because buying habits at the moment are very different. There's either a pent-up latent demand for product, or there's just sheer procrastination with people waiting and seeing what will happen, and they're just not in the mood for spending. It's a really polarised market that everybody has to cater for every dimension of behaviour. So unpicking those against each of the customer segments is a really important task to do. Clearly, this is a very human, emotionally driven situation, and it will no doubt have ongoing impact on the way that we're gathering customer insight, and any hint that you can get from feedback, noise from social media channels, any sentiment that you can pick up on, any feedback that you can actually prompt through all of the digital channels will be really useful to piece together. Having that finger on the pulse in terms of customer segment is a way of working your way through this, because if you can keep up with customer behaviour and changing behaviour, no doubt it will change, and whether it ever gets back to any form of norm is a bigger debate that you hear lots about. But either way, for each unique business, it will transpire in a different way, and you have to own your own unique way of working through that with the combination channels that you have. I guess one of the things that I learned in the last recession when I was in financial services, and it was at the time that spawned lots of the challenger banks. It was a unique situation where suddenly there were just the unknowns that came out of nowhere with a very, very new model. And what we need to be aware of is actually anything that distracts you from your core business that allows any new starters to take your market share is something to avoid. So that's why the ruthlessness of looking at any vanity projects and just cutting those away and really focusing on the heart of your business is important, as well as looking for the other opportunities and second guessing where some of these new starters might be emerging that are entirely in your space, and both protecting and potentially launching something new to address that. So I guess and finally, the whole thing about this is to have not just a finger on the pulse of your own business and the funnel and the KPIs. It's to actually plan for every single scenario that you can possibly think of. So if outside of a recessional world, your normal planning can well be, and it is in my usual role, having a look at scenario A, scenario B, and scenario C. I think in today's world we need to be planning the D's, the E's, and etc. It's just got to have a number of things are flying around in so many places that you have to be ready to be able to discount a route, quickly move on to a new one, and know that you've got the plan in place for that to mobilise straight away. It is a lot of effort, and it's also something that has to be reviewed regularly. But that's the way of keeping ahead. It's having the whole team mobilised around the various scenarios, the what-ifs, and that those what-ifs are not just financial, they're the market, they're the customer behaviour, they're the whether a second wave comes along, whether we find a vaccine. So we've got to think of all of those newsworthy scenarios that are going to impact our businesses.
You mentioned there a lot of different things. Thank you for that. There's a lot of stuff around pent-up demand, which I know that Anna, you're very well aware of in the property sector right now. But in that property area, you do get more sort of like ups and downs. Does that resonate with you when the property market is down? Do those statements resonate?
Yeah, I think they do, and I think one of the things that Debbie's touched on in this conversation is around the importance of staying very, very focused on the market that you are currently participating in. So I think that, understanding your A, B and C plan, being very responsive, being very tactical, being very agile around what is going on for your customers and clients, and then what is going on from kind of a macro perspective is the sort of the ticket into being able to pivot your marketing strategy to be able to be effective and actually to be able to drive back the ROI that you're looking for. I think, one of the challenges that the property market has seen is actually not unlike the challenges that the property market sees in a perhaps more stable market, is that we don't control our own supply and demand. So there's no magical brand new product that a state agency is going to bring out that's going to make you want to sell your flat or rent a new house. It's all customer lifecycle driven, or it is actually economic driven. There'll be factors that drive that supply and demand to come back and go forward. So we find that challenge actually year in, year out in our sector in terms of trying to move through our marketing strategy with one eye on what's happening today and tomorrow, because as Debbie sort of talked about, you're looking at those daily stats, you're looking at the numbers that are coming in, the completions, the exchanges, the lets agreed, or whatever those metrics might be for your business, and you're trying to pivot your solution to enable that to be maximised, whilst also having an eye on the longer term prize, which may or may not be around developing out longer term strategies for your business or the brand. So it's quite difficult. You almost have to wear two hats, I think, as a marketer during this time, or indeed in a service-based business that is more affected by those kind of wider macro factors, as opposed to perhaps some of the more product-related industries that I've worked in the past, which are much more affected by innovation from a competitor.
Okay. So in both of those cases, it's very much about keeping your eye on the situation and monitoring the customer, ideally. I mean, Cath, this is an area that you're quite expert in, I would say. What are your thoughts there?
Just echoing some of the sentiments that it's a really unpredictable time. It's very disruptive, and there's been a massively personal impact on people from COVID-19. So people are on edge. The market confidence is low, although we've obviously heard about some of the pent-up demand in some areas, but it's like no other recession, which just makes you feel that you need to keep your finger on the pulse even more so. There's a recent study from EY recently that stated about 50% of customers expect their lives to change significantly in the future, and 53% say that their values have already changed. So if you want to address these changes in understanding customer needs, you first of all need to understand that context. You need to keep an eye on the economy to provide you the why behind the changes in behavioural shifts. And it will also hopefully help you spot opportunities. You can see potentially where competitors have moved out of the market and maybe made some gaps. You could gain some market share, so there could be some positive elements from this. And also maybe some cost saving. Perhaps some of the auction-based models are a bit cheaper because of competitors coming away. But I think what's been really hard to predict was the increase in digital adoption. It's massively accelerated. People wanted to stay connected, and to do that they use their devices. So there's actually even more digital inventory there to purchase. Again, that might come at a cost reduction. But I think behaviour is just going to be really unpredictable for the future. There is likely to be less brand loyalty, and I think you just need to stay connected to your customer. Their needs are going to evolve throughout this recession. They're not going to stay static. And I don't think you can assume that everybody is going to feel the same either. So you need to really think about segmentation and continue targeting accordingly to those segments. And understanding those needs has been central to our approach at FreshEgg for a long time. But I think it's even more pertinent now in recession. Understanding your customer is going to allow you that agility and to be able to react faster. And I think customer journeys are going to change. So particularly around price points or high price points, people are probably going to spend longer in researching, maybe making less impulsive decisions. So monitoring the shifts in these customer journeys allows you to redefine your customer journey and your marketing touch points and make sure you're addressing those needs, perhaps through your UX and your content to support that new intent. I think the brands that help guide their customers through this time, through their new journeys, and offer authentic content and experience, they're going to stand out. And it hopefully would also improve your customer retention and set you in good stead post-recession. I think if you're not already doing it, practically, I'd probably start planning a continual audience research, making sure that you're abreast of any changes in motivation, behaviours, attitudes, needs as soon as possible if you haven't got that in place. So you need to, as Debbie said, make sure that feedback loop's there as well, so that if you are getting those insights, you know how they can change your scenario planning or adapt efficiently off the back of that. Make sure you're being agile. You need to embed that process and communicate that. I think a key thing is making sure that we can have all these different plans, but we need to make sure that everybody in the teams knows exactly what they're doing and what's expected of them. And part of that is knowing your process. You don't want to be setting up loads of audience research, lots of feedback loops, but then being hamstrung by really laborious administrative processes to get sign-off. So removing some of that red tape will be hugely beneficial to people. And then finally, just a point around data. I think making sure that you've got that robust and agreed measurement framework in place with clear benchmarks of what you're hopefully going to achieve, and making sure you've got a source of truth so everyone believes in that data integrity is, I think, just essential.
Cool. Anna, how do you at KFH specifically keep on top of that sort of like customer intent monitoring?
So difficult. We've got 10 business divisions across our entire portfolio. The lion's share of our consumer business is a state agency, so buyers, sellers, landlords, tenants. And we have some ongoing programs where we have, research at particular times in transactions or in their interactions with us. We have all of the, obviously, all the mapping through our digital strategy to be able to then measure up what sort of intention and action we are seeing. And then actually, I know it's interesting because we're talking about a digital framework here with people who've worked in digital marketing strategy and technology for a very long time, but we also rely on humans. We rely on hearing what has the experience been for people when they've gone into that office or they've rung that office to ask for a viewing or they're going through a transaction. We actually rely on hearing back from our people. So what is the experience that the staff in the offices are having with their customers and clients? What challenges are they having? What are people concerned about? I mean, for the first time ever, and Debbie was talking about this before, you know, we're talking about an event-based recession. We're not talking about a systematic recession. So there's, you know, the signs weren't there that there was a big problem in the actual market. The problem is this pandemic that's come along. And whilst that's incredibly emotional for people, I think in some construct, because it is coming into their personal space around their health and their well-being and their family, it's personalising it in a little bit of a different way than perhaps hitting your bank account or your savings and investments in for your future might be hitting you. Although both, of course, they have emotional elements to it. So I think absolutely, I mean, Nate knows this, I'm obsessed with stats. We want to know the numbers. You want to see what the feedback loop is. You want to see your KPIs. You want to see what your performance on all of your media and your strategies is doing. But many of you will have been involved in customer surveys, in research focus groups. There is always going to be a gap between what someone will tell you and then what someone will actually do. And I think it's an innovator's nightmare, because what you believe might be an opportunity in the market, sometimes when you iterate on that and start to roll it out, you actually find the gap is not quite the same gap that you thought it was. I used to, for a while, work in automotive, and, you know, people will go in and they will be looking at a particular model of car, but all of our stats showed over 5 years that people almost invariably buy 2 models down from what they went in to look at. Some of it's price point, some of the features, some of it's what's available to you in the showroom at the time. So I think it is important, if you're in a service industry like we are in property, and you know, many of you are probably out there in industries where you are connecting with the people who are engaging with your service or buying your products in whatever face that might have. Listen to what people are physically saying to you. If you have an opportunity to have a candid conversation, and particularly if you're in a service business like we are, speak to the people who speak to the customers and see what they are saying. Of course, you know, we're talking about anecdotal feedback as opposed to anything that you're going to get any statistical significance out of. But I think it shows how those two worlds of, you know, facts and data and numbers, and then anecdotal and human experience, really come together to give you a measure. Because I think it's a mistake that many of us have made in our digital marketing careers, particularly sort of 5-10 years ago, when this was the up and coming kind of marketing channel piece. Our obsession with the numbers almost became so severe that we missed some of the anecdotal evidence around the edges. So numbers are everything, but you know, balance is really important in understanding where you can, you know, get to some really, I guess, solid nuggets of wisdom to be able to iterate on.
It's funny, isn't it? I mean, one of my experiences with dealing with many different clients and businesses is that they can be quite insular and they look at themselves from their own perspective. And very rarely go out and get that market insight. And if they do get that market insight, it's usually clouded in mosaic data about demographics and this, that, and everything else. Never really about what does the actual person really want at the end of the day. Debbie, is that something you've seen before?
Yeah, well, yes, but also if we look at the current situation, there are new trends that have been triggered as a result of what's hit us. You know, there are. There's the speed with which businesses have pivoted to digital, if they weren't before, but also look at people's behaviour in this environment. There have been, you know, older generations who've been forced to use digital when they've been lifelong resistors before. Now, that's something that we thought we might have dismissed before and accepted that they only use traditional channels, and now we're having to embrace that within our planning. And suddenly, you know, people are finding that there is a benefit to some of the routes, the channels that weren't, you know, that they didn't embrace before. So factor that in, and then also I think the amount of businesses now that have gone straight for the pragmatic. So if ever we were trying to be perfect with our tech stack or with the way that things connected, and suddenly we were in a world where Zoom is entirely acceptable, connected with WhatsApp, connected with, you know, all of those readily available platforms that people are now using seamlessly, and they've done that themselves. That's not something that we as marketers have pushed to them. So now our job is actually to interpret that and to learn from their new behaviours and flex our marketing plan in the way that we need to. So in the previous recession, I think it was a very different starting point. It was at the point where, you know, the internet was in its pretty much infancy. You know, it was kind of starting to take over the world, but hadn't quite got there. And so it was about a push strategy. You know, everybody was looking at how to completely reimagine their businesses in digital, and it's just really different now. It's definitely consumer and customer led.
Okay. Anna mentioned something there about anecdotal evidence around, you know, the data is one thing, the data will give you loads of insight, etc. There's the power there of actually just going out and talking to your customers. But that whole anecdotal thing leads us into our next topic, which is that idea of brand, which can sometimes, when you're focused on the numbers and you're focused in the detail, the power of your brand can slip between the cracks. So Debbie, what thoughts have you got around that need for brand during a recession?
Yeah, there are papers after papers that have been written since really the 1920s about how brands should continue to invest in their brand marketing during a recession, and particularly during a recession, and particularly even more so during a recession than normal times. So I won't dwell on that because it's almost become the fact now that marketers know as and when a recession comes along. But in our digital world, again, given the set of circumstances that we're now facing, suddenly the digital environment is now having to carry a lot of the weight of that brand and the cohesiveness of the brand and the weight of the brand in a way that I don't think it's had to really work as hard to do before, when there's been all of the, you know, other OOH, TV, etc. supporting that whole effort. And suddenly, without that in play, it really puts the spotlight on the digital channels to not just get the e-commerce bit right, or the funnels right, or the KPI. It's about getting the brand messaging spot on and connected across those digital channels, and timely, so that prospects and customers really think that they're being carried through this in a way where the brand is alive. You know, the brand has always got to feel alive, and if there's anything that we can take from all of those years and years of research about brand investment during recessions, it's about the one thing you don't do is switch the lights off. You have to make sure that you're being seen to be there, and not just be there, but having a really relevant and a today conversation, so it doesn't feel like you've disappeared out of the room for a while and you'll come back when you're ready. You know, you've got to be there moving the dialogue and the story about your brand on. Now, I think that's just so much more critical in this recession than ever before, because I mean, my background is a lot of brand repurposing and reimagining, and we talk a lot about brand purpose, but it really hit the spotlight, didn't it? Where if brands were making up purposes before, they certainly are not allowed to do that now in the rules of the consumer book, because consumers have judged brands, and we all know that list of good and bad brands that have survived this, and why consumers won't be buying from certain brands because of the way that they behaved, or they tried to pull the wool over consumers' eyes during that, particularly during those early periods. So now it's a chance to, if you haven't already as a brand, dust down that purpose to say, right, given the current situation, have we really landed on the right reason for us being here? That society is resting on us to deliver, that nobody else can deliver. And, I think there's plenty of scope using digital channels now in a coherent, cohesive fashion to really create that strong brand presence. And I'm not just necessarily talking then about digital, it's then the spin-offs of that. Look at Brewdog, for example, and how they had to pivot, and they used the digital channels really wisely, and they also then repurposed their warehouses and use the digital channels to actually tell their story. It's a fantastic kind of seamless way of making things work during a recession.
Yeah, and I guess Gymshark have also been quite a success story with their, 1.5 billion valuation. Primarily a social business that was started on and gained a severe following on social. Anna, over to you. How do you approach brand during this, during a difficult market?
Well, I think kind of building on what Debbie's just said then, all of that is absolutely true. And one of the things I think about measuring and assessing your brand presence and keeping the lights on, if you will, as opposed to turning them off, is making sure that you are not just obsessing with your paid channels. So you need to know what your paid channels are, you need to know what your earned channels are, and you need to know what your owned channels are. So where are these sort of digital and also offline channels where you are influencing an opportunity to be growing your brand that you're not necessarily paying for in your media spend per se? Obviously a lot of big, the consumer brands, whether they're like, big multis or whether you've got startup brands, they use influencers in social media, Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, whatever that place is, where they're starting to bring their brands into a more connective space with people. Now actually you pay for that, but it's not necessarily always seen as a line on your paid strategy or part of what our brand plan is for keeping the lights on. So I think marketers have to be really, really smart about kind of digesting how that communication piece works through all channels, paid and earned and owned. To give you like a really interesting kind of example, I guess, from our industry that wouldn't perhaps occur to people outside it, but we have very strong market share in a number of sort of areas in Zone 2, Zone 3, Zone 4 of London. And one of our biggest marketing tools is our for sale and our to let boards that people stick up outside their houses. And, do people think about that as out of home advertising? I do, and my business does, but to customers, but probably not. But where that kind of success breeds success in our markets where we're extreme, where we hold very, very high market share and we have lots of boards hanging around the place, you see that kind of influence of people's exposure to that brand, and then that kind of success breeds success mentality. And of course, in our instance, a for sale or a to let board or a sold or a let board put outside a flat or a house has a success message to it without you actually having to say anything, because it says we trusted the person who spoke to us and trusted what they have done and proven they have done enough to put their brand outside my house and trust them with probably the most expensive asset that I have and perhaps one of the most emotional assets that I have. So I think look at what are your tools that help build your brand in a market authentically, that actually will keep driving your brand presence forward, but they might not necessarily cost you additional money, but know how to use them and know how to utilize them. So, not-for-profits, for example, often have very, very tight budgets. And I know a number of people who've worked in the not-for-profit sector over my time, and those marketers can squeeze more out of a pound than probably any commercial marketer that I've worked with, because they have such tight reins on their budgets. And I think, if you think about that mentality of every single pound counts, which is exactly what Debbie said in the answer to her first question, no vanity projects, this is all about delivery. You take that same approach with brands. So I think, yeah, you have to spend. Yes, you need to still be in the market, but oh my gosh, it's a recession, we should go and spend a couple of £1 million on an outdoor advertising campaign is also not quite right. You just need to assess what's actually going to give you the bang for your buck across all of your channels, made nowhere near easily by the fact that what you might be able to do today in a recession might be, in a pandemic recession, might be something completely different tomorrow. And I think a lot of marketers out there must be thinking, what do I do? I can't commit to big spends in outdoor media or in television or in high production value pieces because I don't know whether that distribution is going to work for me. But I guess the more that you start to get into the digital channels more, the more that you realise that actually there's a lot more at your doorstep that can be utilised, cross-purposed and cross-utilised across digital platforms, which makes, I guess, your digital spend work harder, but also makes the repurposing of that content actually much, much better in terms of return on investment. And we talk about that in our marketing team. And our head of marketing is very pragmatic, and she's very kind of results orientated. So it's always about how much can we squeeze out of what we're doing. And I think in a time like this, that's broadly where you need to think about how you grow your brand. Bring that pragmatism back and make sure you've got your eyes wide open to everything that's going on around you.
And it's an interesting point that Debbie made about digital having to basically do more heavy lifting of brand now than it ever has.
Yeah.
How does out of home work when people aren't allowed to leave home? How does any of that stuff work with the restrictions that the pandemic set? But do you feel, and I'm going to come to Cath to answer this one, do you feel that actually we're seeing an erosion of those typical silos that exist between offline and online here?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's going to need to be monitoring of data. I think a big part of this for me would be setting aside, even I know budgets are probably going to be restricted, but some investment that could be put into test and learn, just so that you can understand the impact on your own channels and your earned channels as well as your paid channels.
Okay, awesome. So we're going to move on to our last topic today before we open up for questions. And if anybody has any questions for our Q&A piece, please do put those in the question and answer feature on Zoom. So just looking at for me, recessions, the biggest thing that comes out of recession is the need for an organization to be agile, to be able to navigate what's coming down the pipe towards them. So going to Anna first, can you talk to us about the need to justify innovation?
Very difficult. I think innovation's an interesting one because it conjures up different constructs for different thinkers and for different organisations depending on what's going on in your world. So some businesses are very long-term focused. They might have 5 or 10-year plans and they're working around a wider trajectory in terms of what they're trying to achieve with their market share or their brand or their diversification strategy. And some are almost a bit more hand-to-mouth, operational day-to-day tactics to keep building their market share moment by moment, working with the restraints and the environment that they're in. I think my answer to that is innovation is in both of those worlds, but they are very different strategies and they need to be treated differently. And one doesn't actually outweigh another. It kind of comes back to that pragmatism. And I think, again, Debbie sort of opened with this in her first piece. You have to know your numbers. If you don't know your numbers, you probably shouldn't be in marketing. I think there's sometimes a perception that, it's quite a creative industry with creative roles, but actually everything that you're doing is about generating some sort of return on investment for the business that you're in. So I think justifying innovation is very much about being inside the numbers and inside your business's strategy, understanding what they're going for, and then pivoting your, tactics around maybe a short, medium and long, or some combination of those innovation strategies to be able to achieve those short, medium and long-term goals. our business has been around for, I think, 45 years, and our founder managing director, Lee, has been with that business for 45 years. So he's ridden every single recession that you've talked about and more. And we've managed to keep a very, functional, a very strategic, a very strong team throughout each of those recessions. And I think a lot of that has been to do with the fact that that innovation focus for today is about how do we maximize the opportunities that we've got, how do we pivot the strategy, how do we transform ourselves to be able to do business in the environment we're in right now. Please, can these people focus on doing that and focus on doing that now? In our business, it was things like rolling out Microsoft Teams to the entire workforce. It was about mobile devices. It was about cross communication, those sorts of things from a pragmatic kind of infrastructure perspective. Whereas innovation for the long term is actually seeing down the road to say, we will come out the end of this. We always come out the end of this. Where do we want to be when we do? And where will our market be and our competitors be? I think justifying innovation is really difficult if you are not close to understanding how and where the decisions are being made. And some businesses, publicly listed businesses, big corporates, sometimes it can be very hard to get to those stakeholders who are making those decisions, but perhaps more of the data is available to you because it's out in the open. Smaller businesses have the opposite problem. You might be able to get quite close to the stakeholders, but you don't necessarily know the ins and outs of the numbers. So where you can kind of maneuver your relationship with your stakeholders to understand the key metrics that the business is going after, of course, some of them will be sensitive. Try to build out what that rationale is to then go and fight for your innovation. Because I think what you will find is that investing in the future innovation is much easier to do if you're coming at it from a commercial standpoint. And that might sound really obvious, but a commercial standpoint isn't just mitigating the direct risk that is in front of me right now, because there are always multiple ways of solving a problem to mitigate the problem that is in front of you now that may be gone in 1 or 2 or 3 years' time, like a pandemic. So I think it's about really taking those two elements, separating them, putting the brain power around them, and then, I guess, iterating on both of those ideas to see whether is there one innovation strategy that is going to tick the box now, and we're going to be able to then move that forward from a transformation perspective to tick this innovation requirement in the future? Or are we talking about two very different things? And then what does that cost in human resource, in cost, in time, in probably one of the most important things in a business, which is actually the cultural adoption of change, because change is very difficult for people. So if you are needing to man a workforce of service people or staff in any kind of capacity, the innovation needs to be adopted by them as well as adopted by the customer for it to make sense. So I think it's about thinking about that broader piece and really making sure you know your numbers.
And I think what we've identified already is the customer behaviour. When the market gets tough, customers will change quite quickly. You're going to have some people losing their jobs.
Yeah.
Some people are going to feel very, very much under pressure financially. We may still have certain elements of lockdown from second waves, hopefully not, but second waves of COVID-19, right? So this is going to drive businesses to innovate at a time when their sense of risk averseness is at its highest, and when the desire to innovate just really isn't there. So can I just ask Debbie, how have you in the past managed to get that still across the line though? So if some of our audience are dealing with somebody who won't sign the business case, what can they do to help that along?
Yeah. Anna talked a lot about that pragmatic come back to the numbers, and I remember producing innumerable business cases to support both the budget and the innovation that we'd identified and we were asking for. Do you know what? There's a lot about really working alongside the finance team, department in these days, really have a very strong connected relationship with your financial unit. In my last role, finance and marketing were side by side on this, and I think that actually stands that business in very good stead for a situation like this, because I think it was only that close relationship with your FD and the people supporting the FD that were actually helping to hone that business case so that it's palatable for boards to listen to. And I think once you've got that over the line, the story behind it, actually, most boards get the fact that you've got to innovate during a recession, whatever extreme of innovation that might be, whether it's a new startup, whether it's an addendum to your existing businesses, or whether it's just a new campaign that you need extra investment for that's a little bit more innovative. I've been obsessed. There's a couple of businesses that I helped during the kind of lockdown period to go online, and one was an online educator, and just looking at the trends there and the innovation that happened in that space just during that period of time was absolutely incredible. And some of the edtech businesses that think they've been in business for a while, it was kind of putting them to shame. And there's innovation just as simple as, for example, John Lewis launching a new revenue stream that is their online courses, for example, to a service that's for customers to supplement the retail sales. And surprise, surprise, a lot of them, what you needed for the workshop are ingredients or products or items that you can get from John Lewis or Waitrose. Now that for me is a great example of some contained innovation there that actually possibly is within all of our gifts in some guise or another. And I think, let's just don't assume that innovation is a massive initiative that becomes, that outweighs all. It can be swift, nimble innovations, as we've seen businesses pivot towards during this time, that actually are within our gift to do. So, I think my learning from a previous recession is all about, it's the people side again, coming back to the people side. Let's repeat that now in this situation, that gets everybody over the line and gets them engaged with what we're recommending.
I like that idea of the cumulative power of micro-innovating. That I think is a good takeaway from this, that it doesn't have to be a massive innovation project. You can micro-innovate using what you've already got. That's a nice takeaway. So going to the questions now, we've got a question that's come in. Looking at the previous recession, did anyone's team, this one's going to put egg on your face potentially, so be careful. Looking at the previous recession, did anyone's team make a marketing decision they wish they hadn't made when looking back? I.e. pausing a particular channel they later realized they shouldn't have, or they took a less cautious approach to budgeting than they should have. Let's go to Cath. Have you got any examples of where that might have happened?
Yeah, I won't name any names. I would say, though, it was based around being too aggressive in terms of restricting resource. So making quite swift knee-jerk reactions in terms of headcount, making redundancies too quickly, rather than looking at cost efficiencies within the business model and processes, looking at time study analysis to see if people could actually be put into different positions. It was actually cutting too many positions too quickly, expecting other people to pick up the slack, which can be done in the short term, but you get burnout very quickly. And let's not forget that this pandemic has had quite a personal impact on a lot of people. That can't happen for a long term. So yeah, I would say for me, the biggest takeaway is don't make big knee-jerk reactions. Think about the longer term and the impact on people.
Anna?
To be honest, I think Cath's just given the example that we had at that time in terms of the last recession. I was in a completely different business then, but yes, I think people is the backbone of this piece, isn't it? Because it's quite difficult to be able to forward forecast when you're going to start coming out of the ditch, but the cost of time and talent development to bring new people in once the market starts coming back is an enormous burden. So I think, yes, I definitely saw that. The other thing that I saw a bit of, which I think sounds really odd, but I did, is where there was almost like a forecasting panic around, we've got this sales and marketing plan. If we hit this goal, we're not going to be able to fulfill it with the product quickly enough because of all of the things that are held up because of a recession. So there's almost like we don't want to spend too much here because we might drive too many leads and then not be able to fulfill them. And you're like, oh, are we having a conversation about you're going to earn too much money? Like, it's quite an odd consideration. But I guess, you know, when you're putting together marketing strategies, you're always sort of KPI orientated around, you know, what you believe you're going to bring in to the funnel, and then what you're going to convert out the back end of that. And because I think during a recession, you lose control of your supply chain, whether that's product or services or decision making or dealing with different markets and different countries, that can also force you to, or you know, instinctively make you put the reins on something to make sure that you don't overpromise and underdeliver to your customers. I don't know whether the business I was working with at the time quite went the right way about it, but I mean, it's a very difficult decision to make because there's so much out of your control, and I think that's the piece that's most difficult for people to get a grasp on. So,
and I think one of the biggest mistakes that, you know, my opinion on this question, one of the biggest mistakes people make is not knowing the value of brand leading. And as a digital marketer through and through, I still, you know, I thoroughly believe in the power of brand. Not knowing its value leading into something like this and immediately cutting it as something you can't measure, can't see, and then very slowly over time seeing some of those metrics spiral down because that influence factor is gone. So I think cutting too quickly on something you can't necessarily see, but which everybody, as Debbie alluded, there's been so many studies, the data all shows that brand is powerful, but just ruling that out. I'm going to go to some of the questions that we got as part of the registration phase now. So I'm going to start with Debbie on this one. Are there any tips or tricks that you could pass on for getting the most out of some limited resources?
Yeah, it's interesting because linked to your last question, mate, the biggest mistake I made in the last recession was in the quest to save money was to immediately go to my agency and saying, right, I'm removing your retainer and we're going to go on to a project-based relationship at the very point in time when you need the goodwill and support and the added extra that actually you can get from your agency. So with the question of how can you maximize what's there already, I would say look at your extended team, your agencies, your suppliers, your network, that actually can get you some greater economies of scale by bringing them in properly and firmly into the fold. And actually the other thing that I would share is, you know, I've had so much more goodwill by actually being honest about where you're short, where the skill sets are short, and where are there the gaps that actually you might have assumed that extended network don't have. But when you start really probing and say, look, how can we all flex here, you suddenly find that actually there are people who will and can absorb some of that extra and also, you know, bring something new and a new perspective to tackling the problem that you've got. So it's a double whammy. You create that team effort and that in it together, you get the goodwill from the whole team. And actually I found that the marketing team or the digital team itself actually get a lot of value from that, because suddenly there's the co-learning, there's the co-tackling of problems, there's the kind of the reward and the recognition once something has been delivered, you know, that you've all shared as an experience. And I have to say, albeit it's a horrible time, and this one might well have eclipsed it. During that last recession, I had some of the most rewarding times of my working career that I've ever had, because, you know, there is that swimming against the tide during a really, really tough time, that you do all come through it together, and you will remember all of that.
Yeah, it's a joint experience, isn't it? So, Cath, we got another question that came through. What advice do you have for somebody looking to move from like a corporate to more like a freelance or agency type role at this stage?
I was looking at that question. I wasn't 100% sure if this person had already made their decision or was looking to make a decision. I think if you're thinking about moving from corporate to freelance or agency, then first of all, if the position is in place, then there's an argument to say that it's not as risky to move in recession, because if that hire is there, there's probably more eyes on assessing those roles. So it's obviously a really necessary hire. And hopefully that business or agency is thinking about the future and actually more stable. So it's not always necessarily risky. However, just make sure that you know your worth and don't let anyone offer you less than your market value just because potentially there might be a bigger pool of talent in the market at that time. In terms of freelancing, I'm probably the wrong person to ask because I'm very risk averse, but it might be worth approaching your existing employer to see if there's something you can do, so you could run freelancing along the side of your existing role. Maybe reduction in hours would be appealing to corporates at the moment if they're looking to cut some costs. Reaching out to freelancing networks to see what the marketplace is like, that might help you understand if it's an idea to move at the moment. In terms of agencies, I'd probably do due diligence around what wins have they had recently, what their financials look like, and understand what their future approach is from the recession, and also what they've learned around this lockdown period as well. I think that would give you quite a bit of insight into the culture of the company. Hope that helps a little bit.
Cool. I'm very conscious of time. We are almost out. I think one of the things that I would also add to everything that you guys have said is, you know, a recession, we will come out the other end of it. And a really important point is not to almost like paint yourself into a corner where you can't react to the market as it starts to recover because you've cut so deep, or, you know, you've restricted everything back. And I think that ties into keeping that eye on the situation, monitoring it, understanding what happens with the customer, etc. So we are out of time today. I'd like to say a massive thank you to Cath, Debbie and Anna. Thank you so much for sharing your experience with us today. And obviously to everybody listening, please accept my thanks for joining us today. Do keep your eye on our social media and on your inboxes for our future webinars. We have a webinar coming through on the 23rd of September about how to mitigate a website migration disaster. And you can sign up for that now on our site. I've also written an accompanying white paper for digital in a downturn. We'll make that available to attendees ahead of time before we release it generally to the general public. So please keep an eye on your inboxes for notice of when you can go ahead and download that. So again, thanks to our panel. Thank you so much. And I think that's it for us today. Thanks very much.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Nate. Thanks, everyone.
everyone.